A group of loud, brash bikers rumbled into a quiet Kyoto street, their roaring engines disrupting the peaceful hum of a tea shop nestled at the edge of an old temple. The bikers' arrogance led them to a seemingly frail older man sitting outside, sipping tea. Little did they know, this unassuming figure was a former samurai, a man who had long sworn off violence, but retained the skills and discipline of his warrior past. When they pushed too far, they would learn a lesson the hard way. The sun hung low over the Kyoto streets, casting a warm, golden glow on the narrow lanes lined with old wooden buildings. A gentle breeze carried the scent of jasmine from the nearby temple garden, mingling with the earthy aroma of tea wafting from the small shop nestled on the corner. The tea shop was a local favorite, known for its tranquility and hand-brewed matcha, a haven for those seeking respite from the bustling city. Inside, a few regulars sipped their tea in quiet conversation. Among them was Kenjiro, an older man with sharp features softened by age. His weathered hands cradled a ceramic cup as he sat by the open sliding doors, gazing at the cherry blossoms swaying in the breeze. Kenjiro had been coming to this shop for years, always alone, always calm, like a fixture of the place itself. The tea shop owner, a kind woman in her 60s named Michiko, moved gracefully between tables, refilling cups and chatting with her patrons. She stopped briefly by Kenjiro's table, her smile warm. "Your tea, as always, Kenjiro-san," she said, placing a fresh cup before him. Kenjiro inclined his head slightly, his voice low but kind. "Thank you, Michiko-san. It's perfect." As always, the peace of the moment was interrupted by the distant roar of engines, growing louder as it approached. The patrons glanced toward the street, their expressions uneasy. Moments later, a group of bikers appeared, their leather jackets and roaring motorcycles a stark contrast to the serene surroundings. They parked haphazardly along the curb, their loud laughter and crude jokes breaking the fragile tranquility. The leader, a burly man with a gaudy chain around his neck, stepped off his bike first. His name was Rick, and he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never been challenged. Behind him were 4 others, equally loud and brash, their boots clunking against the stone pavement as they approached the shop. Inside, the atmosphere shifted, conversations quieted, and Michiko's cheerful demeanor faltered as the bikers pushed through the door. They didn't bother to bow or remove their boots, their heavy steps echoing on the wooden floor. Rick looked around with a smirk, his eyes landing on Michiko. "This place serves food, right?" he asked, his voice loud and grating. "We're starving." Michiko hesitated, her smile now forced. "Of course. Please take a seat, and Rick waved her off, laughing. "We'll figure it out ourselves." He and his crew strolled through the shop, brushing past tables and leaving a wake of unease. The regulars avoided their gaze, clutching their cups tightly. Kenjiro remained still, his attention seemingly fixed on the blossoms outside, though his sharp eyes tracked every movement. The bikers settled at a table near the back, their presence commanding attention. They laughed loudly, making crude jokes that drew disapproving glances from the older patrons. One of them, a wiry man with a scar running across his cheek, grabbed a teapot from a nearby table and poured himself a cup, spilling liquid onto the table. "This stuff's weak," he declared, wrinkling his nose. "Got anything stronger?" Rick leaned back in his chair, his boots propped on the edge of the table. "Hey, Grandma," he called out to Michiko. "Got any sake back there?" Michiko, now visibly uncomfortable, approached cautiously. "I'm sorry, we only serve tea here, but I can prepare something special for you." Rick laughed, cutting her off. "Relax, we'll make do. Just keep it coming." The tension in the room grew thicker with every passing moment. Michiko's hands trembled slightly as she hurried to fetch more tea, while the regulars exchanged worried glances. Only Kenjiro seemed unaffected, sipping his tea with the same calm precision as always. One of the bikers, a burly man with a shaved head, noticed Kenjiro sitting alone. He nudged Rick, gesturing toward the older man. "Hey, check this guy out, sitting there all quiet like he's some kind of monk." Rick glanced over, his smirk widening. Well, looks like we've got ourselves a Zen master." The group chuckled as Rick stood and sauntered over to Kenjiro's table. He loomed over the seated man, his chain clinking as he leaned closer. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue?" Kenjiro set his cup down slowly, his movements deliberate. He looked up at Rick, his expression serene. "You're disturbing the peace," he said softly. Rick blinked, momentarily caught off guard by Kenjiro's composure. Then he laughed, the sound loud and grating. "Disturbing the peace, old man? We are the peace." The bikers erupted in laughter, their voices filling the small shop. Kenjiro remained unmoved, his gaze steady as he regarded Rick. Michiko, standing frozen behind the counter, looked on helplessly. "Careful, Rick," the scarred biker called out. "This guy might be one of those martial arts masters you see in the movies." Rick laughed harder, slapping the table. "Yeah, sure. What are you gonna do, old man? Meditate me to death?" Kenjiro reached for his cup, lifting it with steady hands. "I suggest you respect this place," his voice even, "and its people." Rick's laughter died, replaced by a sneer. He leaned in closer, his tone mocking. "Or what?" Kenjiro met his gaze, his eyes unblinking. "You don't want to know." The room fell silent, the weight of Kenjiro's words settling over the bikers. For a moment, Rick hesitated, sensing something in the older man's presence that unnerved him, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He straightened, smirking again. "All right, Zen Master," Rick said, stepping back. "Let's see what you've got." Kenjiro sighed softly, his grip tightening on the cup. The cherry blossoms outside swayed gently in the breeze, a stark contrast to the brewing storm inside. The tension in the tea shop was palpable as Rick sauntered back to his crew, grinning as if he had won some invisible contest. The bikers laughed, emboldened by their leader's antics, their voices grating against the otherwise peaceful ambiance. Patrons sat frozen in their seats, too afraid to move, their teacups trembling in their hands. Behind the counter, Michiko tried to steady her breathing as she prepared more tea. Her delicate hands moved with practiced precision, but her mind raced. She had seen troublemakers before, but none like these men. Their sheer audacity made her stomach churn. She cast a worried glance toward Kenjiro, who remained seated by the sliding door, his face calm, his focus seemingly elsewhere. Rick clapped his hands loudly, breaking the uneasy silence. "All right, boys. Let's make this place a little livelier, huh? It's too quiet in here." The scarred biker seated closest to the counter leaned forward and grabbed a porcelain teapot Michiko had just prepared. He poured the tea into a cup, but let the liquid overflow, spilling across the polished wooden surface. He laughed, his scar twisting grotesquely as he looked up at Michiko. "Guess I'm not used to such dainty cups." Michiko's lips parted to protest, but she stopped herself. She took a deep breath and reached for a cloth to clean the mess, her eyes darting nervously toward Kenjiro. He hadn't moved, but she could feel his silent presence, steady and reassuring, like an anchor in the chaos. Joel, the wiry biker, stood and wandered over to a display shelf lined with ceramic tea bowls and ornate calligraphy scrolls. He picked up a bowl, turning it over in his hands with exaggerated curiosity. "What's this? Fancy little dishes for your fancy little tea?" "That's a 200-year-old tea bowl," Michiko said quickly, her voice shaking. "Please handle it carefully." Joel smirked, tossing the bowl into the air and catching it clumsily. "Oh, don't worry, I've got great hands." Rick chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Sure you do, Joel. You break it, though. You buy it. Right, Grandma?" The bikers roared with laughter, but Michiko's hands tightened into fists. Her teary eyes flicked to Kenjiro once again. Still, he didn't move. He remained as he was, sipping his tea, as if the chaos around him were nothing more than a passing breeze. Rick's attention shifted back to Kenjiro. He leaned forward, his tone dripping with mockery. "Hey, Zen Master, you're awfully quiet over there. You don't mind us, do you? Just trying to spice up the place." Kenjiro set his cup down gently, the faint clink of porcelain against wood echoing in the hushed room. He turned his head slightly, his gaze locking onto Rick. "You're disrespecting this house," he said softly, his voice carrying an unexpected weight. "And its people." Rick feigned surprise, his eyebrows shooting up. "Disrespect? Us? Nah, we're just having fun, right, boys?" Joel laughed nervously, still tossing the tea bowl. "Yeah, no harm done." Kenjiro's eyes shifted to Joel, his gaze steady and unyielding. "Put it down," he said, the words calm but sharp, cutting through the noise like a blade. Joel froze mid-toss, the bowl wobbling in his hands. The sudden authority in Kenjiro's voice made the biker hesitate, a bead of sweat forming on his temple. For a moment, the air in the room grew still. Rick noticed the shift and stood, his grin returning. "Whoa, calm down, old man. No need to get all worked up. Joel's just admiring your fine craftsmanship." The scarred biker leaned back in his chair, grinning. "Yeah, don't blow a gasket. You're gonna scare the poor guy." Kenjiro didn't respond. His focus remained on Joel, his presence radiating a quiet intensity that made the younger man's hands tremble. Finally, Joel set the bowl back on the shelf, his smirk replaced by a forced grin. Rick clapped his hands, breaking the tension. "There, you happy now, Zen Master? No harm, no foul." Kenjiro returned his gaze to Rick, his face as unreadable as ever. "You should leave," he said simply. Rick's smile faltered, his arrogance momentarily replaced by confusion. Then he laughed, the sound loud and grating. "We just got here. Besides, the party's just getting started." The scarred biker chimed in, his grin widening. "Yeah, we haven't even tried the food yet." Rick turned to Michiko, who stood frozen behind the counter. "How about it, Grandma? Got anything good back there? We're starving." Michiko's hands trembled as she fumbled with a tea kettle, but before she could respond, Kenjiro stood. The movement was slow and deliberate, his frame unfolding like a mountain rising from still waters. He stepped away from his table, his posture straight and commanding, his calm gaze fixed on Rick. "This is your final warning," Kenjiro said, his tone steady. The room fell silent, the weight of Kenjiro's words pressing down on everyone present. Even the bikers, who moments ago had been laughing and jeering, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Rick, however, was not one to back down easily. He stepped forward, his grin returning, though it lacked the confidence it had before. "Or what, old man? You gonna bore us to death with your Zen talk?" Kenjiro didn't reply. He simply stood there, his presence so calm it was unnerving. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Rick's grin faded as he glanced around the room. The other patrons were watching, their eyes wide with anticipation. Even his own crew seemed hesitant, their earlier bravado nowhere to be found. The silence stretched, taut and electric. Finally, Rick scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Come on, boys, let's get out of here. This place is a dump anyway." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances before following Rick toward the door, their boots thudding against the floor. As they left, Rick turned back one last time, pointing a finger at Kenjiro. "This isn't over, old man." Kenjiro watched them go, his expression unchanged. Only when the roar of their motorcycles faded into the distance did he return to his seat, lifting his teacup with steady hands. Around him, the patrons slowly began to relax, their whispers a mixture of relief and awe. Michiko approached cautiously, her voice trembling. "Kenjiro-san, thank you. But do you think they'll come back?" Kenjiro sipped his tea, his gaze distant. He said simply, "And next time they won't leave so easily." The bikers didn't stay gone for long. By the time the sun began to dip behind the horizon, painting the Kyoto streets in hues of orange and gold, the unmistakable rumble of their motorcycles echoed once more. The sound broke through the tranquil hum of the tea shop, drawing anxious glances from patrons and staff alike. Kenjiro sat at his usual spot by the sliding doors, his expression as serene as ever. He cradled his cup of tea, the steam rising in soft curls, as if he hadn't noticed the growing tension around him. But his sharp eyes flicked briefly toward the street, a quiet acknowledgement of what was coming. Michiko rushed to his side, her voice low and urgent. "Kenjiro-san, they're back. Maybe we should close early." He raised a hand, silencing her gently. "No need, Michiko-san. Fear will only encourage them." The roar of engines grew louder until the bikers parked their motorcycles just outside the shop. Rick dismounted first, his leather jacket catching the fading sunlight. His crew followed, each of them wearing cocky grins that barely masked their frustration from earlier. Rick's eyes narrowed as he spotted Kenjiro through the open doors. "This guy," Rick muttered, shaking his head, "thinks he's untouchable." Joel smirked, his confidence bolstered by their numbers. "Let's see if he's still so zen after this." The bikers strode into the shop, their boots clunking against the wooden floor. The patrons froze, their conversations dying mid-sentence. Even Michiko, who had tried to compose herself, backed away to the counter, her hands trembling. Rick walked straight to Kenjiro's table, his grin wide, but his eyes cold. "Look who's still here. Guess you didn't take my warning seriously." Kenjiro looked up, his calm gaze meeting Rick's. "It is you who ignored my warning." Rick barked out a laugh, glancing at his crew. "Hear that, boys? He thinks he's in charge." Joel and Tank chuckled, but there was an edge to their laughter, as if they were trying to convince themselves this would end differently than the last time. The scarred biker, however, stayed silent, his eyes lingering on Kenjiro as if sensing something the others couldn't. Rick leaned closer, placing both hands on the table. "You think you're some kind of big shot, don't you? Sitting here, sipping tea like you're above everyone else." Kenjiro didn't flinch. He took a slow sip of his tea, then placed the cup down carefully. "Respect is not about being above or below. It's about harmony." Rick sneered. "I'll show you harmony." Without warning, Rick grabbed the edge of Kenjiro's table and flipped it, sending the teacup and teapot crashing to the floor. Gasps rippled through the room as patrons shrank back in fear. Michiko let out a soft cry, her hands flying to her mouth. Kenjiro stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He brushed a stray drop of tea from his sleeve, his expression unchanging. "You've gone too far," he said softly. Rick stepped back, his grin widening. "What are you gonna do about it, old man?" Joel laughed, picking up a wooden chair and spinning it around. Yeah? You gonna zen us to death? The scarred biker, sensing the shift in the room, hesitated. Rick, maybe we should— Shut it! Rick snapped, cutting him off. This guy's been asking for it. Kenjiro straightened, his calm presence suddenly heavier, more commanding. This is your last chance. Leave now, and no harm will come to you. The bikers froze, caught off guard by the quiet authority in his voice. For a moment, even Rick hesitated, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He took a step forward, shoving Kenjiro hard in the chest. What happened next was so fast that most of the room didn't see it. Kenjiro shifted slightly to the side, deflecting Rick's push with an almost imperceptible movement. Rick stumbled forward, his balance thrown off by his own momentum. Joel reacted instinctively, swinging the wooden chair toward Kenjiro's head, but Kenjiro ducked smoothly, stepping into Joel's space and striking his wrist with the edge of his hand. The chair fell to the ground with a thud, and Joel yelped, clutching his arm. The scarred biker took a step back, his hand hovering near the knife strapped to his belt, but Rick cut him off again. Don't just stand there, Rick shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. Get him! Tank roared, charging toward Kenjiro with a raised fist. Kenjiro sidestepped effortlessly, his hand shooting out to grip Tank's wrist. With a quick twist, he sent the larger man crashing to the floor, the impact shaking the room. By now, the patrons were huddled near the walls, their eyes wide with disbelief. Michiko clutched the counter, her breath caught in her throat. She had known Kenjiro for years, but she had never seen him move like this. So precise, so controlled, so deadly without being violent. Rick, now red-faced and breathing heavily, grabbed a heavy glass vase from a nearby shelf and swung it toward Kenjiro. Kenjiro caught Rick's wrist mid-swing, his grip firm but measured. He held Rick's gaze, his voice low and steady. Violence is the weapon of the weak. With a sharp twist, Kenjiro disarmed Rick, the vase slipping from his hand and shattering harmlessly on the floor. Rick stumbled back, his confidence crumbling as he realized he was outmatched. Kenjiro stepped back, his posture relaxed but his presence dominating the room. He said simply, his voice carrying the weight of finality, "Take your men and go." For a long moment, Rick said nothing. His chest heaved as he glared at Kenjiro, his hands clenching and unclenching, but he could see it now. The gap between them was too great. This wasn't a fight he could win. Rick growled, turning to his crew. Joel helped Tank to his feet, and the scarred biker kept his eyes on Kenjiro as they shuffled toward the door. This isn't over, Rick spat, glancing back one last time, but his words lacked the conviction they had before. Kenjiro watched them leave, his expression unchanged. As the roar of their motorcycles faded into the night, the tea shop slowly came back to life. Patrons murmured among themselves, their fear giving way to awe. Michiko approached Kenjiro cautiously, her voice trembling. Kenjiro-san, are you all right? Kenjiro nodded, bending to pick up the shattered teapot. I am fine, but they will be back. Michiko frowned. What will you do? Kenjiro placed the broken pieces on the counter, his gaze distant. What I must. The tea shop had barely begun to settle after the biker's dramatic exit when a heavy silence returned. Despite Kenjiro's calm reassurance, the tension lingered in the air like the faint aroma of the shattered teapot. Michiko quietly swept the broken pieces, her movements hurried and nervous. The patrons whispered among themselves, their gazes flitting between the door and the serene figure of Kenjiro. Kenjiro returned to his seat by the sliding doors, lifting a fresh cup of tea Michiko had brewed for him. His movements were unhurried, almost meditative, as if the earlier confrontation had been no more troubling than a passing storm. But Michiko couldn't ignore the weight of his words. They will be back, she murmured, echoing him as she placed the broom against the counter. Kenjiro-san, they've already caused so much trouble. What will we do if they return? Kenjiro looked at her, his gaze steady and reassuring. Fear will only feed their arrogance. It is not the way. Michiko hesitated, glancing toward the door. What if they bring more violence? Kenjiro sipped his tea, his calm demeanor unwavering. Then I will act as needed. The simple statement carried an air of finality, but Michiko could not shake her unease. She had known Kenjiro for years and had always admired his wisdom and composure. But tonight, she had seen a side of him she had only heard about in whispers, a quiet, controlled strength that hinted at a dangerous past. The sound of engines shattered her thoughts. The patrons froze, their faces pale as the now familiar roar of motorcycles grew louder. Michiko's hands clenched the counter as the bike screeched to a halt just outside the shop. They're here, she whispered, fear thick in her voice. Kenjiro set his cup down with deliberate care and rose to his feet. He stepped toward the sliding doors, his posture relaxed, but his presence commanding. The bikers were louder this time, their voices carrying through the open windows as they laughed and shouted. Rick entered first, his leather jacket unzipped and his chain swinging ominously at his side. Behind him were the same crew, their grins sharper, their eyes colder. This time, however, they were carrying more than their usual bravado. Joel had a steel pipe slung over his shoulder, and Tank carried a length of chain wrapped around his fist. Rick stopped in the middle of the tea shop, his grin wide but devoid of humor. "Told you this wasn't over, old man." Kenjiro stood by the sliding door, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. "You have returned," he said evenly, "but your presence is not welcome." Rick chuckled darkly, stepping closer. "Oh, we're not here for your tea. We're here to settle things." Joel tapped the pipe against his palm, the metallic clang sending shivers through the room. "Last time you got lucky. This time it's gonna be different." The scarred biker standing near the door shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't carrying a weapon, but his darting eyes betrayed his unease. "Maybe we shouldn't." "Shut it," Rick snapped, his grin vanishing. "We're doing this." Rick turned back to Kenjiro, his expression hardening. "You embarrassed us, made us look weak. Now you're gonna pay for it." Kenjiro tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze meeting Rick's. "Your pride blinds you. It will lead to your downfall." Rick's lips curled into a sneer. "We'll see about that." He raised his chain and swung it toward Kenjiro, the metal glinting under the tea shop's warm lights. But Kenjiro moved before the chain could connect. He stepped aside with a fluid grace, his hand snapping out to catch Rick's wrist. With a sharp twist, he disarmed him, the chain clattering to the floor. Rick stumbled back, his face red with anger and humiliation. "Get him!" he shouted. Joel lunged forward, swinging the steel pipe in a wide arc. Kenjiro ducked under the swing, his movements precise and effortless. He grabbed Joel's arm, using the momentum to flip him onto the ground. The pipe rolled away, and Joel groaned, clutching his side. Tank charged next, his massive frame barreling toward Kenjiro, but Kenjiro sidestepped again, his movements as smooth as water. He swept Tank's legs out from under him with a well-timed kick, sending the larger man crashing to the floor. The chain slipped from Tank's grip, landing with a heavy thud. The scarred biker hesitated, his hands raised defensively. "Rick, maybe we should stop," Rick barked, glaring at him. "Do something!" But the scarred biker stayed where he was, his gaze fixed on Kenjiro. There was something about the older man's presence, a quiet, overwhelming force that made every muscle in his body scream to retreat. Rick, now weaponless but furious, lunged at Kenjiro with his fists. Kenjiro blocked the first punch with ease, countering with a quick, precise strike to Rick's shoulder. Rick stumbled back, clutching his arm as he glared at Kenjiro with unbridled rage. "You think this is over?" Rick spat, his voice trembling with anger. "You think you've won?" Kenjiro took a step forward, his calm gaze unwavering. "Victory is not about defeating others. It is about mastering oneself. You have already lost." Rick's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The weight of Kenjiro's words hung heavy in the air, a truth he couldn't deny. He turned sharply, gesturing for his crew to follow. Joel and Tank scrambled to their feet, limping after their leader as the scarred biker trailed behind. The tea shop fell silent once more as the roar of motorcycles faded into the distance. Patrons slowly began to relax, their whispered conversations filling the void left by the biker's exit. Michiko approached Kenjiro cautiously, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and concern. "Kenjiro-san, but do you think they'll stay away this time?" Kenjiro returned to his seat, lifting his teacup with steady hands. "They are stubborn, but even stubborn men can learn when they are shown the limits of their strength." Michiko frowned, her unease lingering. "And if they don't learn?" Kenjiro sipped his tea, his gaze distant. "Then I will teach them again." The biker's departure left an uneasy calm in the tea shop. Patrons resumed their seats, whispering among themselves, their voices tinged with both fear and awe. Michiko quietly moved from table to table, offering fresh cups of tea in an attempt to restore the serene atmosphere, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her lingering worry. Kenjiro sat at his usual spot, the rhythmic clinking of his teacup against the saucer the only sound from his corner of the room. His expression remained unchanged, calm and meditative. Even he could feel the storm that still brewed just beyond the shop's walls. Men like Rick didn't retreat for long. Michiko approached him hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Kenjiro-san, they'll come back again, won't they?" Kenjiro set down his tea, his movements deliberate, her brows furrowed, and she glanced toward the door as though expecting the bikers to burst through at any moment. They seemed angrier than ever. "I'm afraid they'll bring more trouble next time." Kenjiro's gaze shifted to her, his voice calm. "Fear only gives them power, Michiko-san. It clouds judgment and makes us weak." She nodded, though her expression remained anxious. "But what about you? You can't keep facing them alone." Kenjiro offered a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I am never alone. Michiko opened her mouth to respond, but the faint sound of engines cut her off. Her eyes widened as the familiar roar grew louder, signaling the biker's return. Gasps rippled through the room as patrons turned toward the door, their fear palpable. The motorcycles screeched to a halt outside, and heavy boots thudded against the pavement. This time, the bikers entered with even more bravado, their laughter louder, their postures more aggressive. Rick led the way, his leather jacket open to reveal a jagged scar running across his chest, a visible badge of his past fights. His crew followed, Joel twirling a steel baton while Tank cracked his knuckles menacingly. Rick stopped in the center of the room, his sharp gaze sweeping over the patrons before landing on Kenjiro. His grin widened, but it lacked humor. Still sitting there, huh, old man? You must think you're real tough. Kenjiro remained seated, his calm gaze fixed on Rick. Your pride blinds you. It will lead you to ruin. Rick's grin faltered briefly, but he quickly masked it with a laugh. You talk a lot for someone who's about to get taught a lesson. Joel smirked, spinning the baton in his hand. Maybe this time you won't be so lucky. Rick gestured to his crew, his voice sharp. Surround him. The bikers spread out, their heavy boots clunking against the wooden floor as they closed in on Kenjiro. The patrons shrank back, clutching their teacups as though they might shield them from the impending chaos. Michiko stood frozen behind the counter, her hands trembling. Kenjiro exhaled slowly, rising to his feet with deliberate grace. His movements were measured, almost serene, as though he were performing a ritual. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, the confidence in their earlier bravado wavering slightly. Rick sneered, trying to reassert control. What's the matter? Finally scared? Kenjiro didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, his bare feet making no sound against the wooden floor. His presence seemed to expand, filling the room with an almost tangible energy. Even the air felt heavier, charged with anticipation. Joel made the first move, lunging forward with the baton raised high. The attack was quick, but Kenjiro was faster. He stepped to the side, his body flowing like water, and caught Joel's wrist with a precise grip. With a sharp twist, he disarmed him, the baton clattering to the floor. In the same motion, Kenjiro redirected Joel's momentum, sending him stumbling into a nearby table. Tank roared, charging forward with his fists raised. Kenjiro pivoted smoothly, his movements effortless. He sidestepped Tank's wild swing and struck the larger man's knee with the edge of his foot. Tank collapsed with a grunt, clutching his leg as he glared up at Kenjiro in disbelief. Rick, now visibly rattled, growled and lunged forward, his fists swinging. Kenjiro met the attack head-on, blocking each strike with uncanny precision. His movements were efficient, each block and counter perfectly timed. Rick's frustration grew with every failed attack, his swings becoming sloppier as Kenjiro dismantled him with ease. The scarred biker, still standing near the door, hesitated. His eyes darted between Kenjiro and his fallen comrades, his hands hovering near his sides. Maybe we should— Shut up! Rick barked, his face red with anger. I've got this! Kenjiro's calm voice cut through the chaos. You do not have this. You only have your anger, and it blinds you. Rick snarled, swinging wildly. Kenjiro caught his wrist mid-strike, holding it firmly. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, and Rick's bravado faltered completely. He saw something in Kenjiro's gaze, an unwavering resolve, honed through years of discipline. With a single fluid motion, Kenjiro redirected Rick's momentum, sending him stumbling backward. Rick crashed into a chair, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. He groaned, clutching his side as he glared up at Kenjiro. The room was silent except for the labored breathing of the defeated bikers. Kenjiro stood tall, his posture relaxed but his presence commanding. He looked at Rick, his voice steady. You have lost, not because of my strength, but because of your arrogance. Rick struggled to his feet, his face contorted with anger and humiliation. This isn't over, he spat, though the words rang hollow. Kenjiro tilted his head slightly. If you choose it to be. The scarred biker finally spoke, his voice shaking. Let's just go. Rick hesitated, his fists clenching and unclenching. Finally, he turned sharply, motioning for his crew to follow. Joel and Tank limped after him, their heads bowed. The scarred biker lingered for a moment, casting a wary glance at Kenjiro before stepping outside. As the roar of their motorcycles faded into the night, the tea shop slowly began to breathe again. Patrons whispered in hushed tones, their awe evident. Michiko approached Kenjiro, her hands still trembling. Kenjiro-san, are you all right? Kenjiro nodded, returning to his seat. He picked up his teacup, now cold, and gazed at it thoughtfully. "Their lesson is not yet complete," he said softly, "but it will be." As the bikers disappeared into the night, the tea shop returned to an uneasy quiet. Michiko, her hands still trembling, began cleaning the broken chairs and spilled tea. The patrons lingered longer than usual, their whispered conversations filled with awe and curiosity about the mysterious man who had just dismantled the bikers with an ease that seemed almost supernatural. Kenjiro sat back at his usual spot, his calm demeanor unshaken by the chaos he had just endured. His focus drifted to the window, where the moonlight spilled over the cherry blossoms swaying in the breeze. Though his face betrayed no emotion, his mind wandered into the past, a time when peace was not an option and violence had been his way of life. Years ago, Kenjiro had been one of the most feared samurai in Kyoto, his blade renowned for its precision and his mind for its strategy. As a young man, he had been drawn into the service of a powerful daimyo during an era of territorial disputes. The battles were brutal, often fought not for justice or honor, but for control and power. Kenjiro's skill with a katana earned him the nickname Shinsei no Yari, the sacred spear. At first, Kenjiro embraced the role, believing he was fulfilling his duty as a warrior. He trained relentlessly, mastering not only the blade, but also the mental discipline that set true samurai apart from mere soldiers. His victories were swift and decisive, and his name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. But over time, the toll of the battlefield began to weigh on him. He saw comrades fall, not in glorious combat, but in futile skirmishes driven by greed and politics. Villages burned, innocent lives lost, and the ideals of honor he had clung to began to feel hollow. Kenjiro realized he was no longer fighting for justice, but for the ambitions of men who viewed lives as expendable. One fateful battle marked the turning point. Kenjiro and his unit were sent to crush a small village accused of harboring dissenters. The resistance was minimal, the villagers armed with little more than farming tools. Yet the orders were clear: eliminate all threats. Kenjiro remembered the screams, the pleas for mercy, and the haunting sight of his blade stained with the blood of innocents. That night, he laid down his sword and walked away from the battlefield. He renounced his title, his rank, and the life he had built. For years he wandered aimlessly, searching for redemption. His journey eventually led him to Kyoto, where he found solace in the quiet rituals of tea ceremonies and the peaceful rhythms of the tea shop. He swore an oath to himself. Never again would he raise his hand in violence unless it was to protect the innocent. The faint clink of a teacup brought Kenjiro back to the present. Michiko had placed a fresh cup before him, her expression filled with concern. "Kenjiro-san," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You've done so much for us, but is this really your fight?" Kenjiro's gaze remained on the tea. "It is not a matter of choice, Michiko-san. Sometimes the fight comes to you, whether you wish for it or not." Michiko hesitated, then sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You've never spoken of your past, the way you moved, the way you faced them. There's more to you than you let on, isn't there?" Kenjiro looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, he considered brushing off her question, maintaining the veil of mystery he had worn for so long. But something in her gaze, her fear, her trust, compelled him to speak. "I was once a samurai," he said quietly, the words heavy with the weight of memory. "I served a daimyo in a time of war. My blade was sharp, my mind sharper." Michiko leaned forward, her eyes wide. Kenjiro sighed, his gaze drifting back to the cherry blossoms outside. "I fought for ideals that I thought were noble, honor, loyalty, but I realized too late that those ideals were corrupted by the men who wielded them. I became a tool, used to take lives and sow fear." He paused, his hands resting on the table. "I left that life behind. I chose peace, but the skills I honed, the discipline I cultivated, they remain. They are a part of me, whether I wish them to be or not." Michiko's expression softened, a mix of sadness and admiration. "And now, you're forced to use them again." Kenjiro nodded. "Only when there is no other way. Violence should never be the first answer, but sometimes it is the only answer left." The room fell silent as Michiko absorbed his words. She had always sensed there was more to Kenjiro than met the eye, but hearing his story made her see him in a new light. He wasn't just a calm, unassuming man who enjoyed tea and quiet afternoons. He was a man carrying the weight of a past filled with bloodshed, striving every day to live by a code he had rewritten for himself. "Kenjiro-san," she said softly, "thank you for protecting us, but I wish you didn't have to." Kenjiro offered a faint smile, the lines on his face deepening. "As do I." Outside, the bikers regrouped at their hideout on the edge of town. Rick paced angrily, his chain swinging at his side as he muttered curses under his breath. Joel sat nursing his bruised arm, while Tank leaned against his motorcycle, his expression sullen. "We need more men," Rick growled, his voice sharp. "Next time we go all out. No more playing games." Joel hesitated. "I don't know, man. That guy's not normal. He moves like—" "I don't care how he moves," Rick snapped, slamming his fist against a table. "We're not letting some old man make fools out of us." The scarred biker sitting quietly in the corner spoke up for the first time. "Maybe it's time we walk away." Rick's glare was venomous. "Walk away? From him? You've gotta be kidding me." "I'm serious," the scarred biker said, his tone low but firm. "That guy's different. He's not just some old man. He's something else." Rick's lip curled in disdain, but the words lingered in the air, unshakable. The tension in the hideout mirrored the unease growing in the bikers themselves. For the first time, they were questioning the fight they had started. Back at the tea shop, Kenjiro finished his tea, the warmth spreading through his chest. He didn't know when the bikers would return, but he knew they would. And when they did, he would be ready, not out of anger, but out of necessity. His oath of peace remained unbroken, but so did his promise to protect those who could not protect themselves. The next evening arrived with an eerie stillness. The tea shop bustled quietly with regular patrons, their conversations subdued. Though the bikers hadn't returned yet, a lingering tension hung in the air, as if everyone was bracing for the storm they knew was coming. Kenjiro sat at his usual spot, his calm demeanor unshaken. He sipped his tea, seemingly absorbed in the rippling surface of the cup, but his senses were attuned to every sound outside. His years as a samurai had sharpened his instincts, and they told him the bikers wouldn't stay away for long. Michiko moved nervously between tables, her hands trembling slightly as she refilled cups. Her gaze darted to the door every few minutes, fear etched into her features. Kenjiro noticed, and as she passed by, he spoke softly. "Michiko-san," his voice a soothing balm. "You are safe. Trust in that." She stopped, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Kenjiro-san, they won't give up. They're too proud to let this go." Kenjiro nodded, his gaze steady. Pride is a fragile thing. It often shatters when it meets the truth. Before she could respond, the now familiar roar of engines tore through the tranquil evening. The sound grew louder, the vibrations rattling the windows. Patrons froze mid-conversation, their faces draining of color as the bikers pulled up outside once more. Rick was the first to enter, his leather jacket catching the light. His grin was wide, but his eyes burned with barely concealed fury. Behind him, Joel and Tank followed, their weapons more visible this time. A steel baton in Joel's hand and a crowbar resting on Tank's shoulder. They weren't alone. 2 more bikers trailed them, their expressions equally hostile. The scarred biker lingered near the door, his face conflicted. He glanced at Kenjiro but quickly averted his gaze. Rick's boots thudded against the wooden floor as he approached the center of the shop. He sneered, his voice cutting through the silence. His eyes locked on Kenjiro. "Hope you're ready, old man. We're not leaving this time without settling the score." Kenjiro remained seated, his calm gaze lifting to meet Rick's. "You've brought more men. That will not help you." Rick barked a laugh, gesturing to his crew. "You think you're some kind of god, huh? Let's see how well you handle this." The patrons huddled against the walls, some whispering prayers, others staring at Kenjiro with wide eyes. Michiko stood frozen behind the counter, her hand gripping a teapot as though it were a lifeline. Joel twirled the steel baton in his hand, his grin widening. "Let's see if you're still so zen when this hits you." Tank stepped forward, his crowbar scraping against the floor. "You've had this coming, old man." Rick raised his hand, signaling his crew to move. Joel lunged first, swinging the baton in a wide arc aimed at Kenjiro's head. In a single fluid motion, Kenjiro rose from his seat, ducking under the swing with ease. He stepped into Joel's space, gripping his wrist and twisting sharply. The baton clattered to the floor as Joel cried out in pain. Tank followed immediately, raising the crowbar high. Kenjiro sidestepped the downward strike, his hand darting out to strike a precise pressure point on Tank's arm. The crowbar slipped from his grip as he stumbled back, his face contorted in shock. The 2 additional bikers hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. Their confidence wavered as they watched Kenjiro dismantle their comrades with minimal effort. "Don't just stand there," Rick barked. "Get him." One of the newcomers, a wiry man with a chain, charged forward, swinging the weapon toward Kenjiro's legs. Kenjiro stepped back, the chain narrowly missing him. In the same motion, he swept his foot low, knocking the man off balance. He landed hard on his back, the chain slipping from his grasp. The final biker lunged with a knife, aiming for Kenjiro's side. Kenjiro pivoted, grabbing the man's wrist mid-strike. With a sharp twist, he disarmed him, sending the blade spinning across the floor. A quick, controlled push sent the man stumbling backward into a table. The room was silent except for the labored breathing of the defeated bikers. Rick's face turned red with rage, his chains swinging menacingly at his side. He stepped forward, his voice a low growl. "You think you've won? You're nothing but an old man hiding behind tricks." Kenjiro stood tall, his posture relaxed but commanding. "This is not about winning or losing. It is about ending your path of destruction." Rick roared, swinging the chain wildly. Kenjiro stepped into the attack, catching the chain mid-swing with his bare hand. The crowd gasped as Kenjiro tightened his grip, pulling Rick forward with a single powerful motion. Rick stumbled, losing his balance as Kenjiro's other hand pressed against his chest, forcing him to the ground. Rick struggled beneath Kenjiro's grip, his pride and fury boiling over. "You think this changes anything?" He spat, his voice trembling with rage. "You'll pay for this!" Kenjiro leaned closer, his voice low but firm. "You have already paid. Your pride has cost you your strength, your dignity, and the respect of your men." Rick's eyes darted to his crew, who stood frozen, their weapons scattered on the floor. Even the scarred biker, who had stayed out of the fight, avoided Rick's gaze. Kenjiro released him, stepping back. Rick scrambled to his feet, his breaths ragged. He glared at Kenjiro, his hands trembling as he clenched his fists, but the fight had left him, replaced by humiliation. "This isn't over," Rick muttered, his voice hollow. Kenjiro's gaze didn't waver and do not return. Rick hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of his defeat. Finally, he turned sharply, motioning for his crew to follow. Joel and Tank limped after him, their heads bowed. The two newcomers trailed behind, their confidence shattered. The scarred biker lingered a moment longer, glancing at Kenjiro with a mixture of respect and fear, before stepping outside. As the roar of motorcycles faded, the tea shop exhaled collectively. The patrons murmured in awe, their whispers filling the once tense silence. Michiko approached Kenjiro cautiously, her voice trembling. "Kenjiro-san, are you all right?" Kenjiro nodded, his breathing steady. "I am fine." "Will they stay away this time?" she asked, her voice tinged with hope. Kenjiro's gaze drifted toward the door, his expression unreadable. "But men like them do not change easily. Their journey is not yet over." Michiko frowned but didn't press further. She began cleaning up the scattered debris, her movements more confident now. The patrons watched Kenjiro with newfound reverence, their whispers carrying words like master and protector. Kenjiro returned to his seat, lifting his teacup with steady hands. The tea was cold, but he drank it anyway, his mind already preparing for what was to come. The days that followed brought a fragile calm to the tea shop. Kenjiro continued his quiet routine, sipping tea by the sliding doors, while Michiko worked with a renewed energy. The patrons, however, spoke of little else but the bikers' repeated defeats. Word of Kenjiro's skill spread through Kyoto's streets, his name whispered with both awe and curiosity. Some called him a master of martial arts. Others speculated about a mysterious past, but all agreed on one thing: he had become a symbol of quiet strength. But Kenjiro knew the matter was far from resolved. Men like Rick did not walk away from humiliation lightly. Each time they returned, their anger grew, their desperation escalating. And desperation, Kenjiro understood, was the most dangerous fuel of all. That understanding proved correct when, 3 nights later, the bikers returned with a vengeance. The engines rumbled louder than ever, their growl reverberating through the narrow Kyoto streets. Michiko froze mid-step as the sound grew closer, her hands clutching a tray of teacups. Patrons turned toward the windows, their faces pale with dread. Kenjiro stood, his hand resting lightly on the table as he listened. This time, there was no hesitation in the bikers' arrival. The motorcycles screeched to a halt just outside the tea shop, the roar cutting off abruptly. A tense silence followed, broken only by the distant hum of night insects. Rick entered first, his chain looped loosely in one hand. His leather jacket was gone, replaced by a sleeveless shirt that revealed the scars on his muscular arms. His expression was darker, as if whatever restraint he'd once held had been burned away. Behind him, Joel and Tank carried weapons, a steel bat and a crowbar, and 3 more bikers trailed them, their faces set with grim determination. The scarred biker was the last to enter. His eyes flicked to Kenjiro, and for a brief moment, his expression softened, but the weight of Rick's glare forced him to fall in line with the others. Rick's voice cut through the tense air. "All right, old man. No more games. No more warnings. This ends tonight." Kenjiro stepped forward, his movements calm and deliberate. "You have returned," he said softly. "You bring weapons. You leave honor behind." Rick's sneer deepened. "Don't talk to me about honor. You've humiliated us for the last time. Joel raised his steel bat, smirking. Let's see how zen you stay after this. Kenjiro's eyes swept over the group, noting their positions, their weapons, their tension. He exhaled slowly, centering himself. You are driven by anger, blinded by pride. That is why you will fail. Rick snapped his fingers, and the bikers spread out, encircling Kenjiro. The patrons huddled against the walls, their fear palpable. Michiko remained frozen behind the counter, her hands trembling as she clutched the tray. The first to strike was Joel, his bat slicing through the air with a metallic whoosh. Kenjiro sidestepped effortlessly, the bat missing him by inches. In the same motion, he stepped into Joel's space, striking his wrist with precision. The bat fell to the floor with a clang, and Joel stumbled backward, clutching his hand. Tank followed, swinging the crowbar with brute force. Kenjiro ducked under the blow, his body moving with fluid grace. He twisted sharply, delivering a controlled strike to Tank's leg that sent the larger man crashing to the floor. The crowbar slipped from his grasp, spinning harmlessly away. The scarred biker hesitated, his eyes darting between Kenjiro and the fallen weapons, but Rick silenced him with a glare. "Don't just stand there!" Rick barked. "Take him down!" The two newcomers lunged simultaneously. One carried a knife, the other a length of chain. Kenjiro pivoted between them, deflecting the knife with his forearm and stepping past the chain swing. He used their momentum against them, redirecting one man into a table and sweeping the other's legs out from under him. The knife clattered to the floor, and the chain followed moments later. The room was a blur of movement, the clash of metal and the sound of bodies hitting the floor filling the air. Kenjiro's precision was uncanny, each move deliberate, each strike controlled. He fought not to harm but to neutralize, dismantling his opponents with a masterful balance of strength and restraint. Rick, now seething with rage, swung his chain wildly. Kenjiro caught the chain mid-swing, pulling Rick forward with a single, fluid motion. Rick stumbled, and Kenjiro struck his shoulder with an open palm, sending him sprawling onto the floor. For a moment, the tea shop was silent except for the labored breathing of the fallen bikers. Rick struggled to his feet, his chest heaving as he glared at Kenjiro with unbridled fury. "You think this makes you better than us?" He spat, his voice trembling. "You think you've won?" Kenjiro met his gaze, his voice calm but firm. "Victory is not measured by strength alone. You fight for pride, and pride will always betray you." Rick clenched his fists, his anger boiling over. But when he looked around, he saw his men defeated, their weapons scattered, their spirits broken. Even the scarred biker stood back, his face heavy with doubt. Kenjiro stepped closer, his presence commanding. "You have a choice, Rick. Continue down this path, and you will lose everything, or leave and find a better one." The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Rick's jaw tightened, his pride warring with the truth. Finally, he let out a frustrated growl and turned toward the door. The bikers limped after him, their defeat evident in every step. The scarred biker paused briefly, his eyes meeting Kenjiro's once more. He opened his mouth as if to speak but closed it again, following his crew into the night. As the roar of motorcycles faded, the tea shop exhaled collectively. Patrons whispered in awe, their fear giving way to admiration. Michiko approached Kenjiro cautiously, her voice trembling. "Kenjiro-san, do you think they'll stay away now?" Kenjiro returned to his seat, lifting his teacup with steady hands. "But the lesson is not yet complete." Michiko frowned, her unease lingering. "And if they don't learn?" Kenjiro's gaze drifted to the moonlit cherry blossoms outside. "Then I will teach them again, until they do." The tea shop settled into an uneasy quiet after the bikers' departure. The regular patrons exchanged glances, their awe of Kenjiro deepening with every encounter. Michiko moved quietly through the room, her footsteps soft against the wooden floor as she cleared the scattered chairs and broken ceramics left behind, but no one spoke of the fear still hanging in the air like a shadow. Kenjiro, as always, sat in his usual spot. His calm presence anchored the room, his steady gaze fixed on the blossoms outside the sliding doors. To him, the battle was not yet won, for true victory wasn't achieved through force. It came when hearts and minds were changed. Across town, in a dimly lit garage on the outskirts, Rick and his crew sat in heavy silence. The roar of their engines was long gone, replaced by the distant hum of crickets. Rick slouched on a workbench, a half-empty bottle of beer in his hand. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his clenched jaw betrayed his thoughts. Joel rubbed his bruised wrist, his voice breaking the quiet. "That guy's not just some old man. He moves like he's from a different world." Tank nodded slowly, his swollen knee propped on a chair. I've been in fights before, but nothing like that. It's like he knew what we were gonna do before we did it. Rick slammed the bottle onto the bench, the glass shattering in his grip. The crew jumped, startled by the sudden burst of anger. "You're all cowards," Rick growled, his voice low and venomous. "You think one guy's enough to scare me off? He's not unbeatable." The scarred biker seated near the door finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "It's not about beating him, Rick. It's about what we're doing. This isn't working." Rick's glare shot toward him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we've been pushing for the wrong reasons," the scarred man replied, meeting Rick's gaze without flinching. "What do we even get out of this? More broken bones? More humiliation? That guy's not like us. He's trying to teach us something." Rick barked a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Teach us? Teach us what?" the scarred man said simply. "Something we haven't shown to anyone. Not to the people in that tea shop, not to ourselves." The room fell silent. Even Joel and Tank, who usually backed Rick without question, avoided his gaze. For a brief moment, Rick's anger faltered, replaced by a flicker of doubt. But pride was a heavy burden, and Rick wasn't ready to let it go. The next evening, the tea shop was quieter than usual. Fewer patrons came, nervous about another confrontation. Michiko cleaned the counter with deliberate slowness, her eyes darting toward the door every time the bell chimed. Kenjiro sat in his usual spot, sipping tea as the sun set behind the cherry blossoms. The sound of engines broke the peace once more, though softer this time. Michiko froze, her hands gripping a cloth as the bikers' motorcycles rolled to a stop outside. The patrons stiffened, their eyes wide with fear, as the door slid open. Rick stepped inside, followed by Joel, Tank, and the scarred biker. Their usual bravado was muted, their movements slower, more deliberate. Rick didn't carry his chain this time, and the weapons the others usually bore were absent. Kenjiro looked up, his gaze steady. "You have returned." Rick stopped in the center of the room, his crew forming a loose semicircle behind him. His hands flexed at his sides, but his usual sneer was missing. Instead, his expression was tight, as if he were holding something back. "You're not gonna fight us this time," Rick said, his voice quieter than before. Kenjiro remained seated. "I never fought you. I only defended what you sought to destroy." Rick shifted his weight, his jaw tightening. "You made us look weak. You made yourselves look weak," Kenjiro replied evenly. "Pride without respect is weakness." The scarred biker stepped forward, his voice steady. "He's right, Rick. We've been fighting for nothing. We've disrespected this place, its people, and ourselves." Rick shot him a glare, but the scarred man didn't back down. "What's the point? Another fight? Another loss? Or do we actually take something from this?" The tea shop was silent, the tension thick. Rick's fists clenched, his pride and anger warring within him. Finally, he exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping. Rick muttered, his voice low, "We won't come back." Kenjiro's gaze didn't waver. "If you leave without learning, you will carry your burden elsewhere. Respect must be earned, not demanded." Rick met his eyes, his expression conflicted. Slowly, he turned to Michiko, his voice halting. "We're sorry for the trouble." Michiko blinked, her hands flying to her mouth in surprise. She stammered. The scarred biker stepped forward, bowing slightly toward Michiko. "We'll fix the damage we caused and pay for what we broke." Kenjiro inclined his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "The first step toward respect is humility. You are beginning to understand." Rick nodded curtly, turning on his heel. Joel and Tank followed, their usual swagger replaced with quiet contemplation. The scarred biker lingered a moment longer, glancing at Kenjiro. He said softly before stepping outside. As the motorcycles rumbled away, the tea shop breathed a collective sigh of relief. Michiko turned to Kenjiro, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Kenjiro-san, you've changed them." Kenjiro lifted his teacup, his expression serene. "No, Michiko-san, they changed themselves. I only showed them the way." The patrons murmured softly, their fear giving way to admiration. For the first time in weeks, the tea shop felt truly at peace. And outside, under the moonlit sky, the cherry blossoms swayed gently, as if bowing in quiet acknowledgement of the lesson learned. The tea shop returned to its tranquil rhythm in the days that followed. Word of the bikers' retreat spread quickly through Kyoto, their defeat and eventual humility becoming the talk of the town. Patrons who had once feared returning to the shop now filled its seats once more, eager to see the place that had become a stage for such remarkable events. Kenjiro sat at his usual spot by the sliding doors, the late afternoon light spilling across his serene face. His teacup rested in his hands, the warmth radiating into his palms. Michiko moved gracefully between tables, her smile brighter and her steps lighter now that the tension had lifted. But while the tea shop had found its peace, Michiko couldn't ignore the lingering curiosity of the patrons. As she refilled Kenjiro's cup, she hesitated, glancing around the room before speaking softly. "Kenjiro-san, everyone is talking about what happened. They call you a protector, a guardian. Some even say you're like the samurai of old." Kenjiro's eyes remained on his tea. "The title of samurai no longer holds meaning for me. I am merely a man who acts when the moment demands it." Michiko sat down across from him, her expression both curious and concerned. "But why did you help us? You could have walked away, avoided all of this." Kenjiro looked up, his gaze steady. "Walking away is easy, Michiko-san, but peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of justice. If I had turned my back, the balance here would have crumbled. It is our duty to restore what we can when we are able." Michiko's eyes softened, her admiration for Kenjiro growing. "You've done more than restore peace to the shop. You've inspired the whole town. Even the bikers seem different." Kenjiro offered a faint smile. "Perhaps they have begun to see the weight of their actions. True change comes when one understands the harm they have caused and seeks to mend it." Across town, in a quiet lot where the bikers often gathered, Rick leaned against his motorcycle, his gaze distant. The usual noise and laughter that accompanied their meetings had been replaced by an unusual stillness. Joel and Tank sat nearby, their bruises mostly healed, their faces pensive. The scarred biker broke the silence. "You've been quiet, Rick." Rick sighed, dragging a hand through his hair. "What's there to say? That old man showed us up." "It wasn't just showing us up," Joel said, his voice uncharacteristically serious. "He could have destroyed us if he wanted to, but he didn't. He held back." Tank nodded, cracking his knuckles absent-mindedly. "He didn't fight like us. He fought like he had something to protect." Rick's grip on his bike tightened. "And we had nothing." The scarred biker stepped closer, his tone gentle but firm. "Maybe it's time we change that. He gave us a chance to be better. We should take it." Rick didn't respond immediately. His mind churned with memories of the fights, of Kenjiro's calm dominance, of the older man's words cutting deeper than any blade. Slowly, he nodded. "Maybe it's time." Back at the tea shop, the day transitioned into evening, the golden hues of sunset painting the wooden walls in soft light. The last of the patrons filtered out, leaving Michiko and Kenjiro alone. As Michiko cleaned the tables, she paused, turning to Kenjiro with a thoughtful expression. "Kenjiro-san, do you think they'll ever return? The bikers, I mean." Kenjiro set his empty cup down, his gaze thoughtful. "If they return, it will not be to fight. Their journey is not over, but they have begun to understand the path they must take." Michiko hesitated, then nodded. "And what about your journey, Kenjiro-san? You've given so much to protect this place. Do you ever think about leaving?" Kenjiro's gaze shifted to the cherry blossoms swaying gently outside the window. "My journey is not tied to any single place, but for now I am needed here. That is enough." Michiko smiled faintly, bowing her head. "We're lucky to have you." As the moon rose high over Kyoto, the sound of approaching motorcycles broke the quiet once more. Michiko tensed, her hands tightening around a tea kettle, but Kenjiro remained calm, his gaze flicking toward the sliding doors. The bikes pulled to a stop outside, their engines cutting off. Moments later, Rick stepped through the door, followed by his crew. This time, their postures were different. No swagger, no weapons, no bravado. Rick carried something wrapped in cloth, his face unreadable. Michiko's heart raced, but Kenjiro rose slowly, his movements deliberate. "You have returned." Rick nodded, stepping forward. "We're not here for trouble," he said, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it. "We came to make things right." He unwrapped the cloth, revealing a beautifully crafted ceramic teapot. Its glaze shimmered in the soft light, intricate patterns dancing across its surface. Rick held it out, his hand steady. "We broke something here. Thought this might help fix it." Michiko's eyes widened, her hands flying to her mouth. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Kenjiro stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Rick. "This gesture holds meaning. It is the first step toward respect." Rick met Kenjiro's eyes, his voice firm. "We're done with the fighting. It's time we did something better." Kenjiro inclined his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "A wise choice. True strength lies in building, not destroying." The bikers bowed slightly, then stepped back, their departure quiet and unassuming. As the roar of their motorcycles faded into the distance, Michiko turned to Kenjiro, tears glistening in her eyes. "They've really changed," she said softly. Kenjiro nodded, his gaze once again drifting to the cherry blossoms outside. "The seeds of respect have been planted. Now they must grow." The tea shop returned to silence, its peace restored. As Kenjiro lifted his teacup once more, he felt the weight of the past weeks begin to lift. For tonight, at least, The world was as it should be, a reminder that even in the face of conflict, understanding and respect could prevail.